So, welcome to week 2 of The Bad Place. Again, hopefully not what you're going to be calling this place after 5 more weeks of listening to me. So, last week I gave you all a survey that sort of wanted to get your views on hell and what we thought about it. And so if you haven't taken that survey yet, I have extra copies and pencils. So if anybody wants to, feel free, raise your hand, and somebody will bring it over to you. But I'll just leave it sort of right here for now. You can do it real quick at the end. It's very quick. You get 4 options, which may not have been well worded, as I discovered when I looked at the responses. So it's which statement most closely reflects your belief about hell. The 3 main options that we talked about, or that we're going to talk about in this class: eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, universalism. And then I suggested, or gave you a 4th suggestion: there's no such place. And so I told you I'd tell you the results that we had from last week, and I thought they were really interesting. Maybe you will too. We had 30 responses back, so I thought it was pretty good. The number 1 response: eternal conscious torment. So I don't know if that's surprising to you. It was a little bit to me, because Episcopalians have a little bit of reputation. Almost a majority, 14 out of the 30, said they believed that. Surprisingly, or funny, I don't know, the number 2 option was there's no such thing. So I think we need to have some of you move all the way over on this side, some of you move all the way over on this side, and you kind of glare at each other from across the great gulf that's been fixed between you here. 11 of you said there's no such thing. Universalism had, universal reconciliation had 3 of you. And then, like any good compromise, annihilationism, nobody liked it, and it only had 2 results. I was thinking about this all week, this sort of split, and I don't know how accurate what I'm about to say is, but just sort of speculating. I kind of wonder if you end up with at least some people in here believing the exact same thing, and yet coming out and picking one of these 2 options, where if you, for example, believe that hell is separation from God and lasts forever, you might consider that both eternal and conscious and torment, but not believe in fire and pitchforks and everything else. And somebody else might believe the exact same thing and say, well, that, separation from God is not a place, it's a state of mind, and so we're going to pick no such thing. So it tells you that I'm an idiot, and you should listen to nothing that I say, and you can end up believing the same thing and have 2 completely different options.
All right, I have a question.
Yes.
Is Rip in the room?
Nobody's wife is. I don't know if that's... This is a safe space, Jim. Nobody's going to...
No, that's okay. Attribution is just fine as far as I'm concerned. I will stand by my comments. It appears to me that you shared the contents of your poll with Rip prior to his writing his sermon today.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not do that.
It's clear to me that Rip saw those findings and said, I need to preach about forgiveness.
Well, I can't wait to hear the sermon.
You're going to love it.
That's great. I hope so. I did so, given this sort of interesting split in the class, whether that is, whether it's a true split or my incompetence that led to the appearance of a split, I'm curious, especially if you checked off eternal conscious torment. Again, safe place, no judgment here in a class about judgment, but no judgment. Especially if you really picked either of these 2, or you would have if you'd been here last week, I'm curious sort of, if you don't mind, sharing what kind of the nuances of your belief. If it's full-on fire and pitchforks, that's great. If it's more the separation from God concept, that's great too. But I'd be curious kind of just sort of where we stand a little more clearly on this.
I check on the first one.
Okay.
I like Geico TV commercial. And there's a latest one with the Pinocchio about getting the and he said, I didn't see the sign. So there was a sign in the Bible talk about that. So I put it simply.
So you would consider yourself more on the traditionalist side of that then. If you kind of ignore the sign, then you kind of get what you get, you don't throw a fit sort of model of
Yeah, I take that position, but I also onto the the reconciliation part of that about I just like Father Will's sermon today. So it's about, the grace of God too. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's definitely a lot of shades of gray that sort of make some of these options blend into each other.
As many of you know who've been going to Paul's classes throughout the years, I was a Baptist, and that's what you were taught, number one.
Yes.
And I'm sure a lot of us, Episcopalians, used to be something else, and I'm thinking that's probably why that was number one. And I'm wondering what they're teaching my grandchildren right now. I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and if it's like some other touchy subjects, like when we talk about Revelation, it's just not mentioned at all, right? That's the especially those of us who are, grew up believing one thing and now kind of come to a place where it's something else. A lot of times, you don't know how you feel about that other thing, except you don't really like it anymore, and so you just sort of, don't talk about it, which is not healthy either. Anybody else want to throw out their views or their thoughts?
Well, I went with there is no such place. The thing is, when you talk about place, it sounds like real estate.
Yeah.
And I think of it as a state of mind.
Like a state of mind, yeah. Somebody did write in on theirs. They circled no such place, and then literally said consciousness ends, which is sort of would be I guess sort of the when I was thinking there's no such place. I was thinking like, hey, this is it, and you do the best you can, and once you die, you're dead. But obviously, yeah, there's no such place as a state of mind, not necessarily
I
a
think
physical
there's
location.
a lot of hell going on, but it's in your mind.
That's good.
Okay, I added mine. I'm one of those people.
Okay.
It's a place where people go who have turned their backs on God. This is like a quid pro quo. So they've already done it in your, and I don't mean to use that overused phrase right now, but a place where people suffer consciously, that's at the end of it. I'm saying at the beginning of it. People have made the decision to turn their backs on God, and that is hellish.
Right, yeah. So that kind of gets to another sort of aspect of this that we're not discussing as much, which is the idea of you kind of create your own hell, and you start that process well before you get to the afterlife.
I was going to say, I think I have checked off universalism, but I don't know that I don't know. I've been ruminating on this since a C.S. Lewis book, and I think it was The Great Divorce, where
Probably.
it's a fiction, but this guy dies, but he doesn't quite realize he's dead.
We'll be talking about that later in the class.
There are people along the way who are trying to get to heaven, and somebody they know from their life comes out, and you have to, reconcile, and how hard it is to do. And it's just a really but it's kind of like when you said that, and that's exactly what I kind of think.
And Lewis is a tough one to categorize because some people would put him up here as sort of eternal conscious torment. I'm including him in the universalism section because I would say he has sort of a soft universalism, which is his phrase that he uses is hell's doors are locked from the inside. So anybody could theoretically unlock the door and walk out, but nobody is. And so it is both eternally conscious and it has an option for universal reconciliation sort of combined. So again, lots of gray, lots of sort of shading between these options. Somebody else had their hand up.
Well, I put separation from God, but it's also separation from community. It's loneliness, it's insignificance. It's, you were talking about the door lock from but in no exit, the play no exit. It's like you go through, you want to get out of hell, just go out through the door and nobody walks out.
Right.
There was this film that came out of it called, it's about the Holocaust, called Escape from Sobibor, and it was the only escape from a concentration camp, which is hell on earth. And when they made the final break, there were people that stayed. They were too afraid to walk out, to run away from the place. Even though they had a clear line to run away.
Yeah. So I think what this shows is that there's a lot of different views of hell, and especially dealing with something as sort of esoteric as the afterlife, and it really implicates a lot of maybe your assumptions about the nature of the body after death, the nature of the soul, of your mind. There's lots of different options out there, and it really is hard in just 4 options to capture lots of nuance there. So in this week, we'll talk a little bit about how we got to this one. And when I say eternal conscious torment here, I'm referring to sort of the classic, what maybe some of us who grew up Baptist or Churches of Christ, or, in the more evangelical fundamentalist strain, really we're sort of taught, which is the place of physical conscious torment that lasts forever, where you might see it in like a Far Side cartoon. It's sort of the stereotype. How did we get there? How has that become sort of, I think, when you just walk up to somebody and say, hey, what's hell like? They probably aren't going to give as many nuanced and subtle opinions as you wonderful people. They're probably going to say, well, it involves demons and flames and that sort of thing. So I want to start us off, of course, with at least one sort of pop culture notion of the afterlife in our show, The Good Place, which we're sort of running through a little bit. If you weren't here last week, The Good Place is a show. It's on Netflix. I think it airs on NBC, or the last season it just did. And Eleanor Shellstrop, who we met last week, has died, and she has gone to The Good Place. It doesn't take her long to realize that they got the wrong Eleanor Shellstrop, and she actually belongs in the bad place. And so now she's trying to work this out with her soulmate. In The Good Place, everybody gets a soulmate that's like perfectly matched for them forever. Trying to figure out how to handle this because she doesn't want to go to the bad place, but she knows that it's wrong that she's in the good place. So, and also in the good place, there's no swearing no matter how hard you try. That'll explain a little bit.
Maybe it's a test. Maybe if you go to Michael and you tell him the truth, you'll pass the test and you'll get to stay.
No way. I can't risk going to the bad place.
Okay, well, maybe it's not actually like all that bad. Let's just get some information first. We'll ask Janet. Hey, Janet?
Hi there. How can I help you? What the fork? Who are you? I'm Janet. I'm the informational assistant here in the Good Place.
She's like this walking database. You can ask her about the creation of the universe or history.
Oh, there was a guy who lived in Avondale, Arizona around 2002. His name was Kevin Peltonic. Is he gay? No. Really? Huh. Well, that's fine. I wasn't that into him anyway. Yes, you were.
Okay, Janet, I have a question.
Okay.
What is the bad place like?
Oh, sorry. That is the one topic I'm not allowed to tell you about. I can only play you a brief audio clip of what is happening there right now.
Okay.
Well, it doesn't sound awesome.
So, no, it doesn't sound awesome. Oh man, the coffee's cold. They thought of everything. So how did we get to this idea of like the screaming and the torture, and then in The Good Place, there's lots of inventive ways that they sort of just drop in the dialogue of tortures that happen with giant, worms and snakes and things like that. It's pretty funny. I think obviously the first place it starts is and this is very special. Not many people get to see this. I'm going to show you an actual picture of hell, not like one of those weird medieval engravings or iconic images from like we did in the Revelation class. So this is an actual picture. So prepare yourselves, kind of hold on to your seats or whatever. And here it is. Look at that. Seems like something's missing. It's pretty green. And there's not really a lot of pitchforks. Maybe not what you were expecting. But this is actually the basis for our view of hell, which is to say the Valley of Hinnom is the place where this all starts. And you can kind of trace the evolution of hell through the Bible. And it starts with the prophet Jeremiah. Before the exile of Judah, of course, Israel has already been exiled by Assyria. Babylon rose up and gave Judah about a century or so of breathing room, and then they came to finish the job. And one of the things that Jeremiah's really mad about, what Judah was doing, is that they were in the valley of the son of Hinnom, burning their sons and their daughters in the fire. And the punishment for child sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom was going to be, in fact, the killing and the dumping of the corpses of the people who were doing this in that valley for the birds of the air, for the animals of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. So our first reference to this Valley of Hinnom is a place where there is fire, where there has been unspeakable violence done, and where there is punishment. All of these concepts are now sort of in the air. Now, as you may or may not be aware, in in Jewish thought at this time, there wasn't really a resurrection from the dead as yet. There was the Sheol, the place of the dead, that all of the dead went to, whether you were good or bad. And that was kind of it. It wasn't really a well-defined concept. But after they go into exile, the Israelites are introduced to Babylonian religions, to eventually Persian religions like Zoroastrianism, and then eventually with the Greek Empire coming through, they're introduced to the Greek idea of the immortality of the soul. And so over time, this idea of Sheol becomes more of like a resting place before a resurrection occurs, where you would find sort of your ultimate judgment. So by the time the last few chapters of Isaiah are written, which is post-exile, as Israel's returning to Palestine, there's this idea of the new heavens and the new earth. And Isaiah, or second Isaiah, or third Isaiah, depending on how many times you want to split it up, talks about how the people of the earth will go and look at the dead bodies of those who've rebelled against Yahweh, for their worms shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. So now, although this doesn't specifically talk about the Valley of Hinnom, we have an idea of sort of an everlasting component to this punishment. And we have, again, an idea of fire that doesn't go out. So again, another little sort of ingredient to the hell recipe. Daniel, essentially the last book written in the Old Testament, because Daniel takes us all the way up through the Greek Empire, through the splitting of that empire, and close to the Maccabean Revolution, right before Rome kind of comes and wipes everything out. And Daniel says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, still a Sheol reference there, shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting shame and contempt. So we kind of have this resurrection of the dead concept here in Daniel as well. So all of this is sort of out there. You have these different concepts, and they haven't really all been put together into a concrete place where the Valley of Hinnom is the place of this everlasting shame, contempt, and fire, until another Jewish prophet comes along named Joshua, or you might know him better by his Greek name, Jesus. And he, in the Gospel of Mark, our earliest written gospel, talks about how, look, it's better if you cut off your hand than have it sin. It's better if you pluck out your eye. So it's better to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have two eyes and to be thrown into Gehenna. And so what is Gehenna? Well, it's really literally just taking the Hebrew Gehinnom for the Valley of Hinnom, and it's the Greek taking that and saying, okay, and making it Gehenna. It's the same word. Just like how English borrows words from other languages, and sometimes we don't even bother translating them. We just turn them into English. Where their worm, so then he says, where their worm never dies, the fire is never quenched. So he quotes Isaiah 66 while talking about the Valley of Hinnom. So he brings those concepts together. Of course, he has some other things to say about what we consider hell today. Matthew 25, which is the parable of the nations, where they come before him, and he talks about, if you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Those who have not done it for the least of these, depart from me into the eternal fire. And now we have a new edition here, which is prepared for the devil and his angels. We already talked about the evolution of the concept of Satan in the class a couple of years ago, so you missed out if you weren't here for that one. And then the other famous story that Jesus tells here is the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which is another sort of mixture of ideas, because the rich man and Lazarus, they both die. But Hades, or Sheol, the place of the dead, is no longer a value-neutral location. Now it's the place where the rich man is being tormented. Hades is now the place where you die, and if you don't go to heaven, or in this case to the bosom of Abraham, then it's just sort of assumed that you're going to be tormented. He's in agony in these flames, and clearly conscious, because he's having a conversation with Abraham. So this all kind of... you can kind of see how this develops over the course of the Bible. And now, after Jesus, we have a few references in some of the different letters. Come back. In 2 Thessalonians, there's a mention of eternal destruction. In Jude, which is kind of a tricky book anyway, it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, which serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. And then finally, our sort of main text, I think almost everybody gets their visions of hell from, is, it's very disturbing, I agree, is Revelation, which we did talk about last year, if you remember. Revelation 14, the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Those who worship them and receive the mark also drink the wine of God's wrath. the cup of his anger. They're tormented with fire and sulfur, which might also be sort of a Sodom and Gomorrah reference there. In the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. The smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. And then that lake of fire shows up 6 chapters later when the devil is thrown in there. And it says the devil, the beast, and the false prophet will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And a few verses later, joining them, anybody whose name is not found written in the book of life. So, a little disclaimer. I'm interpreting these as sort of they have traditionally been interpreted, and in the coming weeks we'll talk about maybe other ways they could be interpreted. But you can see how after you've gone through and read the Bible and get to the end of Revelation, your default position, especially as somebody who's sort of reading it, might be, what is hell? Fire. It lasts forever. People seem to be conscious in it, and it's got the devil and the beast and these other bad figures in there. But it's also pretty bare bones. There's not a whole lot of flesh on that. You kind of just get some basic ideas. And it's certainly not as fleshed out as we have in our heads today, I think. But that is sort of how you get from that beautiful green valley to images like this, which I spent a lot of time looking at this. I think it was in our church growing up. I don't really remember where I saw it. But I like to, so first of all, heaven will never need to worry about heat, like any cold, when you've got a heat source like this, like right next door. But you've got your lake of fire here, you've got your heaven, you've got the cross that serves as the bridge here, you've got your sociologically interesting concept of the city as sort of the focus of all sin and violence. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time talking about that. And then you've got all the people kind of going down the hill, coming off into the flames there, with the neon arrows pointing the way. And if you've watched It's a Wonderful Life, you know that neon is a sure sign of sin. This is like Pottersville on steroids or something. And then you've got your very few people who actually make their way across the bridge over to the... I'd be going on hands and knees with this drop on either side, and I'll tell you that. Anyway, so that's how you get from the beautiful green valley of Hinnom, which probably was not so beautiful or green back when it was a site of child sacrifice and death, but to this sort of idea. Now, the earliest Christians also had ideas about hell, and I want to read a little bit to you. The Apocalypse of Peter is kind of funny because it's written around 125. So if you remember from Revelation class last year, Revelation is also written somewhere in the first part of the 2nd century. They're written almost at the same time. And actually, they're the earliest known list that includes all 27 books of the New Testament that we currently have, includes the Apocalypse of Peter connected to Revelation. And it says, a lot of Christians think that these are both inspired by the Holy Spirit and worth reading, but you should be careful about it. So the line between what was canonical and what was not is sometimes a little gray, and the Apocalypse of Peter is just on the other side of that line, and was considered part of the Bible, as to the extent they had a Bible back then, was considered inspired by God by some early Christians. So keep that in mind when you hear passages like this. And I saw also another place over against that one, very squalid, and it was a place of punishment. And they that were punished and the angels that punished them had their raiment dark, according to the air of the place. And some there were there, hanging by their tongues. And these were they that blasphemed the way of righteousness. And under them was laid fire, flaming and tormenting them. And there was a great lake full of flaming mire, wherein were certain men that turned away from righteousness. And angels, tormentors, were set over them. And there were also others, women, hanged by their hair above that mire which boiled up. And these were they that adorned themselves for adultery. And the men that were joined with them in the defilement of adultery were hanging by their feet and had their heads hidden in the mire, and said, We believe not that we should come unto this place. And it goes on and then concludes, O God, righteous is thy judgment. So, in an alternate universe somewhere, this is part of the Bible. Very early on, we see, and that's very Dante-like, isn't it? This idea that we have these sort of, or I guess the environmental, what do I do with it? We have these ideas of certain sins requiring certain specialized penalties, and that's just right after the Revelation of John was written. Despite that, there's really not a whole lot of example of Christians talking in depth like that about hell in the earliest centuries of the church. Really, the only person that you might have heard of that does is Tertullian, and I won't take the time to read it because I might not even finish this presentation by the time we have to get out of here. We'll just continue it for next week. But Tertullian was a really prominent apologist from North Africa. He died in the early 200s, and around 200 he wrote a little treatise about the shows, which were held in Rome, and you can imagine those shows were not always very good for Christians to be part of. And so he's like kind of the revelation from John, like the Apocalypse of Peter. He's writing from a place of having been persecuted, of having been having some really negative thoughts about Rome and the things that Rome was doing, either mocking the Christian faith or outright killing Christians. And so he writes this pretty bitter deal, saying, basically at the end saying, I can't wait. I will be thrilled to see what happens at the end of time when all of these philosophers and all of these people who go to the gymnasiums and all of these people who worship these false gods get what's coming to them and they burn in the flames. And that's within 100 years of Revelation having been written. We already see that our concept of hell is shading into less a, ooh, I don't want to go there, and more into I hope you go there. I think we need to be a little careful when we talk about hell, because it's clearly, and I don't want to say like, oh, Tertullian, what an idiot, because look, we have never suffered, most of us, I think, have never suffered the stuff that Tertullian and the earliest Christians of these first couple of centuries suffered in Rome. We'd probably be a little angry too, and we'd probably think, and that's what we talked about with the apocalypse. That genre is designed to sort of give comfort to people who are suffering and say, look, you're not going to get justice in this life, but you're going to get justice in the next life. And so for them, justice is a little violent. So without a whole lot of examples in the earliest church, how do we get sort of this more robust idea of hell, theological, philosophical, there's arguments made for hell now, whole books written about it. And how did we get there? Well, we got there because somebody called AAA, and of course by that I mean Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas. I knew that's what I know you knew that's what I meant. I mean, who doesn't think about them on a regular basis when you're driving down the highway? So over the course of about 800 years, they really put the meat on the bones that we got for hell. And so we'll start, because Augustine, honestly, when we talk about what we believe in the West as Christians, especially as people who grew up in America in the 20th century, we owe a tremendous debt, whether good or not, to Augustine, because he was really the first comprehensive thinker of Christianity, and he had the good fortune to be writing just as Rome fell, which meant that his beliefs sort of carried through for the next 1,000 years or so. And so Augustine, in writing The City of God in 426, just a couple of years before he died, his is really the first full defense of eternal conscious torment over and against other options. So he's actually there saying, because believe it or not, universalism and annihilationism have been around just as long as eternal conscious torment has. But it's because really of Augustine that we have eternal conscious torment as our default, because he's the one who put it all together and said, no, these options are not right. These objections to eternal conscious torment can be answered, and here are the answers. And so he does, and he combines it with a couple of other ideas that he really sort of solidifies and perpetuates. Original sin. The idea, of course, that everybody is born wicked, and not just born with a sin nature, not just born with a propensity to sin, but born, of course, he didn't have the concept of genetics, but essentially born genetically sinful because of the act of sex. So all of our hang-ups about sex, that guy. Because of his own life experiences, he believed that sex was, if not inherently sinful, something you should avoid doing as much as possible, and the act itself transmitted essentially the gene of sin from one generation to the next, and that's original sin. And then he also added to that mix penal substitutionary atonement. So not just the idea that Jesus died as a substitute for us on the cross and saving us from sin and death, but as a legal substitute, because otherwise God's wrath would have fallen on us. So this idea of original sin, penal substitutionary atonement, and eternal conscious torment sort of a trinity, if you will, of ideas that essentially make God's wrath and therefore hell the default option for every person who's born. So what does that mean for somebody who dies as a baby and wasn't baptized? Hell. Sorry, babies. That's what you get. So that's sort of where we get the first real theological and philosophical underpinnings for the version of hell that I think a lot of us are familiar with, at least in the broader culture. And then you got to wait 800 years or so, and you get to Anselm, 600 years, I can add math. Anselm was another sort of apologist. His famous work is Cur Deus Homo, which literally translated, why the God-man? Why does God have to become human? It's sort of, as happens every few hundred years, Christians are like, let's talk more about the incarnation. It's a good deal. But in that, he offers sort of the definitive justification for, I said philosophical, it's really a legal justification for hell. He's at the height of the Middle Ages, the feudal system is in place, and in the feudal system, if you rob from your neighbor, that's bad, you get a certain punishment. If you rob from your feudal lord, that's worse, and you get a worse punishment. And if you rob from the king, then that's really, really bad, and you get the maximum punishment. Well, what if you sin against God, an infinite being? Then you deserve an infinite punishment. The punishment that you get does not match up with the act that you've done. It matches up to the person that you have sinned against. So he says, so heinous is our sin whenever we knowingly oppose the will of God, even in the slightest thing. You can't make satisfaction unless you restore something greater than the amount of that obligation under feudal law. Well, how do you restore something greater than the amount of an infinite obligation? You can't. So the just thing is to be punished infinitely. This is still the reason, if you're going to push somebody as to why hell is just, this is the reason. It's been there now for 1,000 years. And it's from Anselm. Finally, you get Aquinas and his Summa Theologiae, which from the 1270s, he died writing it. So, I guess there's worse ways to go. And he has another couple of additions that he adds to this that we still will hear today. That damnation is not a limit on God's omnipotence, right? So this is one of the objections that's raised a lot of the times. Look, if God wants everybody to be saved, and God is all-powerful, then God should just save everybody. And Aquinas recognized that question, and he said, well, no, the damnation is an expression of God's justice, so it's not a limit on his omnipotence. And that's sort of maybe a little bit of a proto-free will argument. Now, free will is very much a concept of post-Enlightenment democracy, the idea that we all get to sort of make our own way in the world and make our own choices and have some sort of, just consequences for those choices. And that's not really the world of the Middle Ages, but you can see that is already sort of coming into play. And then he also added this fun one, but the saved will actually watch the damned suffer so as to enjoy their beatitude more thoroughly. So I don't know if that's like we're all going to sit around like, or if it's going to be more like we'll appreciate more like what we've got in heaven, having watched the damned be tormented. That's hard for me to swallow. Maybe y'all feel differently, in which case we can talk later. But the other thing, he wasn't quite as hard as Augustine in that he was like, well, okay, maybe it's a little much to say that babies who aren't baptized are going to hell. So those go to limbo, which is still hell, but they just won't suffer. They'll just sort of stare at heaven longing to get there, but will never be able to get there. That's what limbo is. And so this idea, which you may have heard of being in limbo, you can thank Aquinas. And so from there, it kind of moves out of the realm of theology and philosophy to pop culture, so to speak, to the extent you have pop culture in the 1300s when Dante is writing the Inferno. And I wanted to read a little bit when we was talking about limbo. Of course, if you're not familiar with the story of the Inferno, and really of the Divine Comedy, because Dante is taken by Virgil, the Roman poet, through the 9 circles of hell, and then he goes up to purgatory and eventually ends up in paradise. And so the whole thing is more this idea of like trying to get the readers to sort of want to be in paradise and not be in hell. But of course everybody remembers Inferno because it's the most interesting. And Dante spends a lot of that time basically taking revenge on various Italian noblemen and clerics that we have, that I don't have any idea who they are, but they're all being punished very severely for things Dante didn't like what they did. And it kind of gets old. But, Virgil takes them across, and they're on the gates. It is abandon hope, ye that enter here. And Dante says, here sighs, plaints, and deep wailings resounded through the starless air. It made me weep at first. Strange voices, horrible outcries, words of pain, tones of anger, voices deep and hoarse, and sounds of hands among them made a tumult, which turns itself unceasing in that air, forever died, as sand when it eddies in a whirlwind. He's not even there yet. That's just the people waiting to go across the river. But when he talks about limbo, I think it's really interesting here. So Virgil takes them to the first circle of hell, and Dante says here there was no plaint that could be heard, no complaint, except of sighs, which caused the eternal air to tremble. And this arose from the sadness, without torment, of the crowds that were many and great, both of children and women and men. And Virgil says, well, let me tell you about who these people are. They sinned not, and though they have merit, it suffices not, for they had not baptism. And seeing that they were before Christianity, they worshipped not God aright. And of these am I myself, as Virgil lived before Jesus. So Dante's like, well, did anybody ever kind of get out of limbo and go up to heaven? And he says, well, I was new in this condition, so I just died, when I saw a mighty one come to us crowned with the sign of victory. He took away from us the shade of our first parent, of Abel, his son, and that of Noah, of Moses, the legislator and obedient, Abraham, the patriarch, David, the king, Israel with his father and his children, and with Rachel, for whom he did so much, and many others, and made them blessed. And I wish thee to know that before these, no human souls were saved. So he's describing there the harrowing of hell. The idea that Jesus, after he died, before he was resurrected, descended to the dead, as we affirm when we recite the Apostles' Creed, and rescued souls out of hell. And now, you can take a much more universalistic aspect on the harrowing of hell and say that Jesus broke hell permanently and rescued all of the souls that were there. Dante says it was basically the best of the people from the Old Testament were saved into heaven, and everybody else is just sitting there looking at heaven, wishing that they could go. The other person who kind of really affects our view of hell is Milton, and his poem Paradise Lost. So Dante's the 1300s, Milton is 1667, and of course, everybody I think had to read this in junior high or high school, but where Satan gets thrown out of heaven and lands in hell. And so Milton's description of hell as a bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire, who durst defy the omnipotent to arms. He talks about reserved him to more wrath, for now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. The dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge fed with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. So, that's happy. But you can kind of see that these sort of works are the ones that cement this idea of what hell is in our consciousness, but they're still sort of works of description to the extent that they are evangelistic works. They're essentially just sort of describing really bad things and sort of leaving it to the reader to be like, maybe that's not for me, maybe I should figure out a different way. Well, 1667 sort of marks really close to the end of one era of human history and begins another in the early 1700s, which is the Great Awakening. At least when I say human history, I really mean the history of the West. Because in the early 1700s, we have the Great Awakening, which is a much more overt emphasis on evangelizing. And it includes an emphasis on sort of a scientific method of evangelization. We are now in the era of scientific discovery and figuring all these kinds of things out about how the world works. And evangelists like George Whitefield, like Jonathan Edwards, find that you can use hell to great advantage to convince people to come to Jesus. So we have fire and brimstone things like this wonderful hymn by Isaac Watts, written for children, There is beyond the sky a heaven of joy and love, and holy children, when they die, go to that world above. There is a dreadful hell and everlasting pains. There sinners must with devils dwell in darkness, fire, and chains. Can such a wretch as I escape this cursed end, and may I hope whene'er I die, I shall to heaven ascend. Then will I read and pray while I have life and breath, lest I should be cut off today and sent to eternal death. Isn't that sweet? Sing that to your kids at bedtime. Amy's going to sing it to her second grade class on Monday. There's a little child here. That's so nice. All right, so this is the kind of thing we start getting in the 1700s. And of course, fire and brimstone, not limited just to Isaac Watts, but of course, Jonathan Edwards as well. And I think last week somebody mentioned sinners in the hands of an angry God. That is, of course, the great sermon by Jonathan Edwards. And it is very well written. Here's a little paragraph. So that thus it is, that natural men are held in the hand of God over the pit of hell. They have deserved this fiery pit and are already sentenced to it, and God is dreadfully provoked. His anger is as great towards them as to those that are actually suffering the executions of the fierceness of his wrath in hell. And they have done nothing in the least to appease or abate that anger. Neither is God in the least bound by any promise to hold him up one moment. The devil is waiting for them, hell is gaping for them, the flames gather and flash about them, and would fain lay hold on them and swallow them up. The fire pent up in their own hearts is struggling to break out, and they have no interest in any mediator. There are no means within reach that can be any security to them. In short, they have no refuge, nothing to take hold of. All that preserves them every moment is the mere arbitrary will and uncovenanted, unobliged forbearance of an incensed God. So, he concludes it, as you might expect, with a call, an altar call, if you will. Therefore, let everyone that is out of Christ now awake and fly from the wrath to come. The wrath of Almighty God is now undoubtedly hanging over a great part of this congregation. Let everyone fly out of Sodom. Haste and escape for your lives. Look not behind you. Escape to the mountain, lest you be consumed. The end. That's the end of the sermon.
One of our favorites today, I think it was the words to the communion hymn is an Isaac Watts.
Oh yeah, we have lots of Isaac Watts.
Yeah, we do.
He did all 150 Psalms in hymn form. He did lots of great stuff. But we haven't sung that one yet for some reason. Maybe I'll talk with Rip and see if we can get that one for next week. And you can see that Jonathan Edwards has all of those images that we saw from the Bible, that we saw from pop culture like Dante and Milton, from the idea of comparing hell to Sodom, which we saw in Jude. He does that too. Funny thing is, Edwards was known to preach in a very monotone, unceasing voice, just basically like going to an academic conference, reading off the page, no variation in tone, and yet people still flocked to convert, which that's you see why. 1741. So, that's pretty intense. What do we make of this vision of hell? How does this make you feel? Anybody coming forward? Escaping the wrath to come?
What do these people do for amusement? I mean, hey.
Well, Puritan is not a pejorative for no reason. They didn't celebrate Christmas because that was too secular. So, it's, there's definitely, it's definitely a different time.
But I think this goes to your observation that this turns the table from, well, I don't want to go there, but I know he's going there.
Mm-hmm. It does. There is a lot of that in there.
Because it's easy to imagine that he who did you wrong or he who you thought did not live up to or whatever, run the gambit of things. Those people, them guys, they belong there.
Yeah. And I'd say it's even not necessarily, you don't even have to have somebody specific in mind, although I bet we all do. I think it's even just the seduction of feeling like you're one of the select group that knows the truth and everybody else is wrong. We see that seduction in a lot of different ways in our society, maybe especially today. And I kind of wonder if that's part of what has driven the power of hell for so long, you know? I kind of wonder that. What else do we think about this?
Good way to keep people in line, too. You know?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. And I didn't want to put in there because I think people can kind of go a little overboard with conspiracy theorism, especially about the early church and its connection to the Roman Empire. But there is obviously the church being essentially wedded to the Roman Empire in the 400s becomes a big part of why Christianity sort of becomes a worldwide event, but also part of a lot of some of the more troubling doctrines in Christianity are the result of being sort of perpetuated by the state as opposed to by Jesus. And one of those is that Augustine's view of eternal conscious torment was very convenient for Roman rulers at the time to keep people in line. And that might have been one of the reasons why, especially in the West, it became dominant over and against other ideas that were prevalent at the time as well. I don't want to get too much into that because you can conspiracy theorize yourself to basically, the Da Vinci Code and say that all of Christianity is, a conspiracy theory and a hoax, and that's nonsense. But anyway, so you kind of see here when you have to justify this, a couple of points as to where people sort of have to fall on this. First of all, the justification is primarily biblical. People aren't going to these extents, rightly or wrongly, to talk about justify hell philosophically, theologically, evangelistically, without the Bible sort of making it sound like hell exists. And if you have a certain view of the Bible that requires all aspects of it to be correct, historically or scientifically, or requires it to be correct as you read the plain text in your common language, then you have to come up with justifications for hell, because I think on its face, hell is really hard to jive with the idea of God as love, right? So you have also a heavy reliance on God's sovereignty, right? Hey, God is God, we're not. God can do whatever God wants to do. Didn't talk much about this here, but free will becomes increasingly important, especially post-Enlightenment, as democracy and the idea of egalitarianism, everybody being equal. It kind of lets God off the hook a little bit, right? Well, God doesn't send people to hell, people send people to hell, right? They choose to go there. They're the ones that are making these choices. And Anselm remains surprisingly influential for a 1,000-year-old idea based on feudal law. Anselm is actually still influential. So I bring this book back up, The Four Views on Hell, that Zondervan published a couple of years ago. And the guy, Denny Burke, who's a biblical scholar at, I think, an evangelical college, these are some of the arguments he makes. To sin against an infinitely glorious being is an infinitely heinous offense that is worthy of an infinitely heinous punishment. He actually tells a little parable. If you walked by and you saw somebody pulling legs off a grasshopper, or pulling legs off a puppy, or pulling legs off a baby, your response to these sins, although on the surface the same, would actually be much different based on the person being sinned against. And so that's the argument that he's making on page 21 of his book published in the year of our Lord 2016, is Anselm's argument that he published in 1098. He talks about it as a punishment intended to magnify the justice of God, which sounds a little bit like Aquinas. And then, when I talk about it being primarily biblical, he says, even if we can't answer any of the other arguments, even if our objections are never fully resolved, the Bible said it, and that settles it. Now, the question I always ask when somebody says the Bible said it, and that settles it, is whose interpretation of the Bible said it? And that's the question of lenses that I mentioned last week. Because I agree, plain text reading in English of the translations that we have most available to us of these verses that I showed you would lead you to believe in a hell that Dante and Milton and the Apocalypse of Peter and Isaac Watts and Jonathan Edwards all describe in some form or another. So the question then is, what lenses are they using? Are they the lenses we're using? Should they be the lenses we're using? And we'll talk about some of that next week. So there we go. I thought I was going to get through it all, but look at that. It took me more than an hour the 2 times I ran through it this week. So last week we finished up our welcome and introduction, our little flame there. This week, eternal conscious torment. So next 2 weeks we'll kind of unpack what I think was a very quick, rapid fire, here's the history of hell, here's the history of 2,000 years of doctrine about hell in 40 minutes. And so we'll sort of unpack that a little bit. Logically, like how much does this really make sense philosophically? And then, and I might just sort of combine all these and do so don't pay much attention to what this says. We'll also look biblically, do these verses actually say what it seems like they're saying? And then theologically, how does this affect what we think about God? And so it's a little intense, I know, to go through all that with all the hell and the brimstone and the anger. So hopefully, you can go get some ice cream now or something cool. And then, so once we unpack or deconstruct internal conscious torment for a couple of weeks, we will work on these last two and maybe see if there's some other options that you might want to consider or not. So, unless anybody has anything else they really need to get out there, it's probably about time for us to go.
Comments.
Yeah.
The beginning, you presented the AAA. That's interesting because I think we look at. I think probably will be the next week to talk about philosophy, the logic, and because I'm really I love the formation, and I think the three AAA, the three guys that really says so much about hell, because I think it talk about human history, and then we come down to the point of people said human history is a history of violence. And also, we really, in looking at the first 200 some years, that it was really the judicial system is really weak and also not existent in that sense because of the reward and punishment.
Yeah.
And so we come to a lot of time, we talk about, how we can really, even the Old Testament, we talk about, revenge. And if you do something, this horrible, you probably will reap your result from all your behavior.
Yeah.
And
we will definitely do that.
So I think that
we'll talk a lot about how our views of justice have changed and whether or not that changes our views of hell. Because I think you're right, it's very much a retributive view. And maybe now, or maybe, there's always been an option other than retribution as being appropriate for punishment. Yeah. So, well, all right, I'll let y'all get going. But thank you all very much for your time.